Hello and welcome to the second part of this UI and navigation tutorial of 3D Studio Max. And what we'll be looking at here is this panel here on the right hand side, which will probably be where we'll spend most of our time when modeling. We've got 6 different tabs here, and each tab has different options underneath it. So right now we're in the Create tab, which is set by default when you open the program. But we'll take a look at all the others. So we've got the Create panel, then we've got the Modifier list, the Modifier tab, which will allow us to modify all the objects that we've created. We've got the Hierarchy tab, which will allow us to affect the pivots and different transform tools of our created objects. We've got the Motion tab, which we probably won't be using because we won't be using animation in these tutorials. We've got Display, which we'll be using quite a lot. It allows us to change the color of our objects and the wireframe color as well. It'll also allow us to show and hide a specific objects depending on specific categories, and also freezing. Freezing basically means that if I have an object that I don't want to edit, but I'm editing something that's kind of in the way of it, if I freeze the object that I don't want to edit, it will just not allow me to select it and stuff until I unfreeze it. And then we've got the utilities, and basically utilities are just, we won't be using most of them. We'll be using measure and poly counter, which you can't see here because these aren't all the utilities options. If we click on more, you'll see all the utilities that you can use, and polygon counters here, we'll probably be using that because it will show us our polygon count. Again, you can access these through all of the tools up here, but I think it's really neat that in 3D Studio Max you have all of the options that you pretty much want inside of these tabs. So let's go back to the Create tab, and I'll show you how to create a box. Inside the Create tab, you've got different options as well. You've got creation of shapes, creation of lights, cameras, helpers, space warps, and systems. We probably will only be using these first 4, and right now, for the sake of this tutorial, we'll only be using the Geometry tab. And inside the Geometry tab, again, I have even more options, and I'm only looking at standard primitives now, but you've got a load of different options down here. Right now, we'll just stick to standard primitives, and I'll explain to you what a primitive is. A primitive is basically the most basic object that you can start the construction of a complex object from. So say, for example, I wanted to make a screen monitor. I would just start with creating a simple box, and then edit that box from there to make the monitor. So these are very simple shapes, like you've got boxes, spheres, cylinders, torus, cones, tubes, pyramids, and stuff like that. So it's all very simple. It's all very simple shapes. So to create a box, I'm just gonna left click on the button here that says box, and now I'm entered creation mode. When I'm in creation mode, you'll notice that my crosshairs have changed into, well, that my cursor's changed to a crosshair, sorry. And when I left click and hold, I can change the size of the base of my object. So let's say I wanted my box to be this size, then I can release my left mouse button, and as I move my mouse, I will change the height of the box. And again, when I left click again, I will finish the creation. Now you've noticed that we're still not outside of creation mode because we've got our cursor still set as a crosshair. So each time I left click, I'll be creating another box, which may not be what you want. So to exit creation mode, all I need to do is right click inside my 3D space, and I'll exit creation mode, as you can see. So now I can just delete the extra boxes that I didn't want to make and focus on showing you what I can do with this one. If I go to the Modify tab, I've got a bunch of different options here. I've got the name of the object, which I'm going to call Tutorial Cube. I can change the color of my object by selecting here. You can use the 3D Studio Max palette, AutoCAD palette. It doesn't really matter, it's just the color of your object, and it won't actually be the full color once you texture it and stuff. But yeah, so let's change my color to red, and again, I can use any of the colors, the full range color if I want. I can press OK, and as you can see, my box has turned to red. And then I've got the modifier list, which we'll be looking into later. And then we've got, we'll be using that quite a lot. And then we've got the parameters. And right now I want to look at parameters because I can change in a very precise way the size and shape of my box. So for example, if I wanted my box to be 50 units long, I could just press 50 there and press enter. And as you can see in my 3D space, my box is changing. So again, if I want the width to be 50, I'll change it to 50. If I want the height to be 50 and make a perfect cube, I've got a 50 by 50 by 50 cube here. So it's really simple to generate different size objects. You can either just do it on your own through the creation tab, or you can do it through the modify tab and have a more precise idea of what your object is going to be like. And right underneath it you see length segments, width segments and height segments. Now this we'll only be using when we're doing editable poly modeling. And right now we're just using primitive modeling, so we shouldn't really play with them, but just for the sake of showing you what they do, I'm going to show you what these actually do. So if I press F4, it will show me the topology of my object. And by topology I just mean the construction lines of my object. So if I, for example, add 3 length segments, it will make 3 segments on the length of my box, around the whole of it. The same with the width. If I want to add 4, I can add 4, and the same with the height. I can add 6, I can add 6. And again, you can change this to whatever way you want. When we're using primitive modeling, it doesn't really matter. But when we go into editable poly, this will be really useful because we have created a number of faces and verts that we can just manipulate and edit and move about and rotate to basically change the shape of this box to whatever we want. So right now I'm going to just bring these back to 1. And actually I'm going to show you the way I entered this edge face kind of mode is by pressing F4, as I said before, but I can also access it through here, and here we have different options of what we're going to be showing. So I can change my shade into shaded instead of realistic, which you won't notice much of a change, especially if I got edge faces on. So if I show you the difference between realistic and shaded, it might not be very noticeable inside of your well, from the video. Then we've got consistent colors, which hopefully will be more visible, which basically sort of hits a more sort of blocky light on the object and makes it more of a block color. Then we've got obviously edge faces, which we'll add, and we'll keep this up realistic. Then we have hidden line. We've got wireframe, which basically shows us the topology of our object without any shading at all. So this will be very useful when we're looking at the number of verts and stuff we have in our objects. So again, if I change this to 3, you can see our wireframe is changing. But again, I'm just going to keep this to 1. And we've got the bounding box, which just actually just shows us, as I enter segments here, it won't show us the segments inside. It will just show us the binding sort of edge edge construction lines that generate this object. If I go out of it, it'll just go into the normal wireframe view, and if I go into the binding box, again, just the binding edges. But for now, we're just going to keep it on realistic and get rid of edge faces, which I can toggle with F4. And this is what I'll be using the most. I'll be toggling every now and then once I start editable poly modeling. But for now, we're just using primitive modeling, so we can just leave it as is. So now that we've started with this cube, what I'm going to show you is how to move, rotate, and scale your object, and basically edit it in the way you want it. To move, I can just click this button here, and every time I select an object now, I'll be able to move it. And as you can see, you've got like this little widget here that has 3 axes. You've got the X, Y, and Z axis. And if I want to move my object in the Y axis, I can just left click and move it. I can move it on the X axis, left click and move it, and I can move it on the Z axis, left click and move. Now if I want to use it on all axes, on 2 different axes, I can use it the X, Y axis and move it around here, I can use the YZ axis and move it around here like this, and the same with the Z. So it's really important that you get familiarized with these concepts of moving, rotating and scaling, because we'll be using them a lot when we're modeling. So again, the move tool, you can move in whichever axis you want. And now we'll go into the rotate tool. Rotating, again, you've got your three different objects. Your three different axes in which you can rotate. So now we're rotating on the Z axis, we can rotate on the Y axis, and we can rotate on the Z axis. As you notice, each axis has a different color. X axis is red, Y axis is green, and Z axis is blue. And I can also rotate on all of the axes if I just click in any of the sort of middle area of this. And I can also rotate based on the camera if I just rotate on this outer circle that's outside here. Then we've got the scaling tools. And as you can see here, it's got like a little arrow on the bottom bit, and if I click and hold, I've got different scaling options, and I'll explain to you what they do in a second. But for now, we've got scaling on all axes if I just click and drag in the middle. Then I've got scaling on the Y axis only, which will edit the size of my object. But as you notice, when I scale this, it doesn't edit the parameters here. So be careful that once you start using these scale tools, you won't be able to edit these as comfortably as you were before. And then obviously I can edit on the X and Y axis. And again, we'll be using these a lot. And again, we could just constrain it to 2 axes instead of instead of all of them. So yeah, again, just have a play around. And now I'm going to show you the difference between this kind of scaling. This, what it will do, it will only allow us to scale in the axis that it will bind it to 2 like planar axes. Then we've got this scaling, which will scale sort of very ununiformly. I don't tend to use any of these 2 options. I just tend to stick to the normal scaling options. So it's up to you if you want to play around and use it. But again, I just stick to these. And now you know how to move, rotate, and scale an object. But I have to explain to you what the pivot does. And here, as you can see, we're going to be moving the tool based on our pivot. And if I just go on select mode, this X, Y, and Z axis that you see here, this is where our pivot is placed. And if I select the move button, it's going to move based on our pivot. And I said before, if I change the hierarchy, if I go to the hierarchy tab, I can affect the pivot. So if I move the pivot of my move, if I move the pivot up onto here, and then I click again, my pivot will have moved on. The pivot of my object will have moved onto that onto the area in which I've chosen to move it to. So say I want to, it doesn't really affect much for moving because I can just move it. I'd still move in the object in any way I want. But say if I wanted to rotate, now it's going to rotate from this pivot. So we're going to have a different rotation. It's going to be rotated based on our pivot, and that's going to change quite drastically. And for example, if you wanted to make a door, you put the pivot where the hinges are, and then you have an opening and closing door. Instead of rotate it from the middle, just from the pivot that you need it to. And then you've also got the scaling tools, which will also just scale from the point at which you're at. So yeah, it's very important to understand what changing the pivot does. And if you want to, for example, affect the pivot and just center the pivot to the object, you can click center to the object. You can align it to another object that you choose, and then you can align to world and change the pivot in that way. This will change. It's very important that you understand your pivot and where it is, because it's going to change a lot the way you modify your object. And if we just want to reset the pivot to the original shape, you can just to its original position. You can just click it there. Again, this box has been edited too much now, so I'm just going to delete it. But just for you to understand the basic options of moving, rotating, and scaling, just create a box. To exit create, I right click, I can move in any axis, I can rotate, I can scale, and also what I'm going to show you is the shortcuts for each one of these. So if I wanted to move, I can just press W and it will change into move. If I want to rotate, I press E, and if I want to scale, I press R. So W, E, R, W for move, E for rotating, and R for scaling. And I'm going to be using these a lot when I do other tutorials. I never actually just go ahead and click here. I just use my different shortcuts because it's much faster when I'm working. So yeah, just make sure that you get familiarized with these shortcuts. Again, W, E, R, and we can affect the length and size of our box. So 80 by 40 by 90, and I can make the box whatever I want. Then we can also change the pivot point, and if I want to change the pivot point to, say for example, close to this vert here, I can just effect pivot only, release it, and now I can rotate the object based on the pivot that I've chosen, and scale it. So that's going to do it for this small tutorial. Now you understand what this panel does here. It's very important that you understand it properly because you'll be using it a lot. And I just want to say, just play around, play with extended primitives, see what you can do. You can do oil tanks, which, you know, add I don't know, bevelness to the mesh. You can create other kind of shapes. You can create a chamfer box, which is very useful because you can sort of add a rounded edge to your box. And again, you can create loads of different objects, compound objects. You can create particle systems, body objects, doors. Again, it's just really simple to create a load of primitives that then you can go ahead and edit and get a proper model afterwards. I'm just going to select all of these and delete them and just say play around with it. Play with lights and shapes as well if you want, but we'll be looking at those when we actually go into lighting and rendering and stuff like that. So that does it for this one.